Hey everybody, it's Josh Runquist here for Heavy Debriefings, and I can't believe we're already this far along in the timeline. When I was in first grade, finishing up kindergarten, we're already at the top 10 albums of 1995. Coming in at number 10 is the debut album from the legendary band Moonspell with Wolfheart. And even on their debut album, even with getting signed to such a great label like Century Media, they were able to really find their sound. And while it's gotten more gothy and more proggy over the years, I really love the way that they started off. You get elements of gothic metal, you get that little bit of folk metal that they still kind of have to this day. It's a little more black metal, but you can still hear elements of melodic death metal going on. There's so many different things that you can appreciate about this album. And considering the fact that this was written all the way back in 1995, 29 years ago, is absolutely mind-blowing when you think about it. The fact that it was getting dialed in this well, and bands who are able to experiment with so many different genres to be able to create something that works so well for them, and they were able to dial it in this well, and it's not even their best album. Although, there is the argument that it is. It's not my personal favorite, but it is one of the highest ones for me. The fact that it's on the debut album, fantastic, magnificent approach to being able to incorporate all of these different styles and make them work as a whole. Coming in at number 9 is Clutch with their self-titled album. And while the first album is more of a foray and still the band trying to figure out their sound, it was more in the hardcore territory more than anything else. But on the self-titled album, they were able to really figure out more of the style that they wanted to go and have almost pretty much continued that to this very day. It has a lot more hard rock elements, there's a lot more bluesy moments, there's a little bit of hardcore going on in particular moments. I mean, A Shogun Named Marcus is a great example of that with a nice little hardcore riff, but it still works for what a lot of people would consider to be stoner rock. I mean, if I do enjoy stoner rock, Clutch is pretty much the biggest example of that. Corrosion of Conformity, I guess, with the Pepper Keenan era as well, but that's really as far as it goes. Why? Because Clutch nails it so perfectly. It's rock, it's blues, it's metal, it's hardcore, and a little bit of Sabbath worship if you must, but it really got dialed in on this album. I mean, yeah, you have a stoner anthem like Spacegrass, you have a nice heavy hitter like A Shogun Named Marcus, you have Big News 1 and 2, which is one of the finest examples of a 1-2 punch that you can really find in this style. And all the way back here in 1995, the band dialed it in so perfectly. And again, much like I talked about with Moonspell, but very different band, Clutch was able to really fine-tune their sound so early in their career, and that's awesome. At number 8, you may say Sabotage, but William Shatner says Sabotage. But in all seriousness, it's Sabotage with Dead Winter Dead. And this album sparked a whole career for the band Trans-Siberian Orchestra. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, of course you know, basically the international Christmas anthem, Sarajevo 1224. A lot of people thought that started with Trans-Siberian Orchestra, and you're not wrong for thinking so. But it actually dates back all the way back to 1994 with the original Sabotage version. Of course, that is a classic Christmas carol that they were able to make, but that heavy version that you know and love originally started off here. But if you want to check out the rest of the album, which I highly recommend that you should, you get a very dramatic and theatrical album that is filled with such great symphonics, little bit of prog. I mean, they've always had a little bit of prog, but I wouldn't necessarily call them a progressive band. A pure heavy metal band, of course, and a great slab of what America can do when they put out a good metal band. And of course, so many things led into the downfall of Sabotage later on, and then of course, with several of the members being able to jumpstart back up again with Trans-Siberian Orchestra, why don't you go back to 1994 and check out Dead Winter Dead? It's my personal favorite Sabotage album, and hey, maybe you should check it out as well. At number 7, I have Opeth with their magnificent debut, and quite underrated debut, Orchid. If you checked out my Backwards Marathon episode on Opeth, where I rank the whole Opeth discography, you'll know that I used to be a moron, and call it Orchid, because I never saw the word before. I guess I just don't know that much about flowers. But in all seriousness, the debut album from Opeth, is a stark change from what you think you know about Opeth if you discover them in their mid-era, and especially if you know them during their current era. While the progressive death metal is a little bit in there, especially Orchid, and a little bit on the next album, Morning Rise, it is much more in the progressive black metal territory. Well, you can make the argument that Opeth are the forefathers of progressive death metal. It's actually Edge of Sanity. Opeth really did start to find their roots here, and they were able to try to figure out who they wanted to be. They had the longer songs, they had the acoustic passages, they had occasional clean vocals, but not many. All of that is covered here in strides, but of course, with every subsequent album until they hit what considered to be their high watermark later on, these first two albums are where the band really started to find their footing and figure out who they were. So when you go back and listen to the progressive black metal era of Opeth, it might be a little jarring, but I think it's absolutely worth it, and there's a reason why it's on my list. Coming in at number 6 is Faith No More with King for a Day, Fool for a Lifetime. And this continues the trend of, especially in the Mike Patton era of the band, which is all the albums except for the debut, the band never writes the same song twice. They never write in the same style twice. Sometimes they don't even hit the same genre twice on an album. This has everything from lounge music to heavy metal to pop rock, alternative. It's everything that you love about Faith No More, and outside of We Care A Lot, the debut album from Faith No More, I've always seen this one considered to be lowest ranked, although the last Faith No More album there is an argument for, and hey, while I think about it, maybe I should do a backwards marathon on Faith No More as well. There is some underrated classics on this album. I mean, how can you not love a great hard rock, heavy metal song like Digging the Grave? How can you not love a great bombastic song like Ricochet? And how can you not love the smooth sounds of Evidence? There's so much to love about this album, and if you enjoy Faith No More, at least what you've heard from them, and you're not too familiar with them, I couldn't recommend checking out this album enough. You'll find some very great, underrated gems on here. Coming in at number 5 is Meshuggah with Destroy, Erase, Improve. And this is the album that kind of started it all, especially for that late 2000s, early 2010s bands in that onomatopoeia genre that you know and love so well. Actually, gent is not a genre. Periphery talks about that on their latest album, which just came out yesterday at the time of checking this out. Meshuggah created their own sound on this album. No one else was doing anything like Meshuggah was doing on this album, and it's the only Meshuggah album I really enjoy from start to finish. With the exception of the 21-minute standalone song, or EP, depending on how you look at it, this is the only one I can listen to from start to finish without getting bored. Their albums have some great songs attached to them, some that are even better than what's on this album, or nothing beats I in my opinion, but it gets close. But trying to listen to it as a whole just becomes a bit tiresome after a while. I don't hear that on this album. It's got that progressive metal sound, it's got that groove metal sound. They're able to experiment a lot on this album because they were finding their sound, and they really dialed it in with this album. And, you know, as the old saying goes, don't fix what's not broken. And they never really did from this album. The only thing that kind of changed was there was a little bit of thrash on this album still from their debut album, and they pretty much got rid of that after this. And of course, when you hear things like Chaos Fear, and especially by Obzen, all of that was completely gone. But this sounds like the most organic Meshuggah album. Everything else is improved upon in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not to perfection, like I mentioned, like this is the only album I thoroughly enjoy from start to finish. But there's a reason why it's here at number 5, because it is just that good. And if you want to hear that sound that people associate them with, check out this album, because it doesn't sound tiresome, it doesn't sound overdone, it just sounds like Meshuggah. And at number 4 is one of the most seminal melodic death metal albums ever made, At the Gates with Slaughter of the Soul. This is a band that kind of focuses a little bit more on the thrash metal side of melodic death metal, but they nail it so perfectly. The songs are usually fast, or at least mid-tempo. It just has that great brutality that you're looking for. Being able to see so many of these songs in a live setting when I saw At the Gates realizes that they hold up so very well no matter what time that it's being played at, whether it's back in the mid-90s or in the mid-2010s. it just works so perfectly well. I mean, there's so many bands of this era that were able to make melodic death metal what it is even today, and they were pioneering it back in the early to mid 90s. Until At the Gates came back in full force, this is probably the best At the Gates album. And if you just want that fast look at what melodic death metal was all about in the mid 90s, kind of underrated to some people, kind of overrated to others, for me, it's right in between, it hits so perfect, and it is held up in high regard for such a good reason. If you want to check out what that 90s melodeath sound was all about, you have no excuse to miss out any longer on Slaughter of the Soul. Coming in at number 3 is one of the greatest sophomore albums of all time, with Fear Factory's Demanufacture. This brought in the industrial fans, this brought in the death metal fans, and put them together in perfect harmony. While being a concept album which is a little above my head, and you need to check it out yourself. I mean, how does a self-bias resistor actually work? Can it actually work? But in all seriousness, like, the music is so heavy, the songs are so much fun to listen to, whether you just want to sit there with your glow sticks, or you want to be able to check them out in the pit. Burton C. Bell's perfect vocals going along with this, Dino's perfect guitar riffery, Christian's perfect bass lines, and of course the amazing drum work of Raymond Herrera. While, of course, the band is in a very different state nowadays, especially with their brand new singer Milo taking over, there are so many things that are happening on both sides, whether you're in the Burton camp or in the Dino camp. Let's just go back to a simpler time in 1995 when you didn't have to worry about all the debacle and debate. You just had to listen to some good music. And if you wanted something nice, heavy, and industrial, there was no better option than Fear Factory's Demanufacture. Coming in at number 2 is Blind Guardian with Imaginations from the Other Side. This is arguably not just my favorite Blind Guardian album, but one of my favorite power metal albums of all time. It is the perfect inclusion of power metal and speed metal with just the right amount of folk metal combined together to create one of the most seminal albums in the entire genre. While for some people it gets a little too proggy or a little too folky, or there's not enough power metal elements to it, I mean, there's so many things you could say about this album. For me, none of that matters. It works together in perfect harmony. The songs are so catchy, and when they get super fast, they get super heavy. Hansi's vocals are just sublime on this album. And funny enough, it's the last album he plays bass on. From here on out, he just focuses on his vocal ability. But it just captures everything that I love about the band. And on other albums, it focuses a little more on power metal, or a little more on folk metal, or orchestral. And of course, in the early days, more of the speed metal sound. This is the album that had everything, and it's done magnificently. And of course, one of my favorite power metal songs of all time, Born in a Morning Hall, just so happens to be in the middle of this album. Seriously, if you've never checked this out, just give it a try. And coming in at number 1, how could it be anything other than Symbolic by Death, the progressive death metal album of all progressive death metal albums. And so many people hide this as their best album of all time. They have 7 great albums to be able to choose from for that. Although for me personally, it is not what I would consider to be their number 1 album. I think in the more proggy sense, it is their best progressive death metal album. It has the great technical ability, it has great progressive ability, it's got a little bit of mellow death in there. Chuck changes from the death growls to the more black metal screams on this album. The magnificent drumming of Gene Hoglan shines on this album on his final appearance with Death Before Death to All, and some of the most magnificent songwriting, not just of 1995, not just of the 90s, but in metal in general. There is a reason why so many people hold this in such high regard, and I do as well. There's not much I can really say about it other than that. It's just an album you need to experience for yourself, and if you like it, you understand. And if you don't like it, well, there's not really much else I can do to try to describe it for you. Different strokes for different folks. But for me, it is the best album of 1995. And that does it for me. Thank you so much for checking out my top 10 albums of 1995. Whether you agree, disagree, or just want to crap on me for my own personal taste, comment down below. And of course, like, comment, share, subscribe, notification bell, all of that good stuff if you want to see this keep going. Of course, I will keep this going all the way through to my 35th birthday coming up in August of 2023, which is just a few short months away now. and I don't like the sound of that. But until my next top 10 video, interview, review, backwards marathon, or any other kind of video that I put up here on the Heavy Debriefings podcast channel, this is Josh Runquist saying, see ya.